Okay, hello and welcome to this evening's presentation as part of Doors Open Baltimore, presented by the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. A big thank you to everyone who donated to be with us today. And also a major thank you to all of this year's Doors Open sponsors and BAF supporters. And before I turn over to William, just a few announcements. We are now at the end of Doors Open Baltimore with just one more weekend to go. And tomorrow, I hope you can join us for a special virtual presentation with Nicole King about Poppleton. We'll be talking about the history of this historic African-American neighborhood and also the current preservation efforts underway to help preserve it and also to fight displacement. Should be a very good presentation. And now today's presentation, I'm going to introduce today William Knupp, who is a rope access facade inspector and restoration specialist based in New York City. He received his bachelor's and master's of architectural history from the University of Virginia and wrote his MA thesis on James Wines and Site. He has served on the board of the Victorian Society, New York since 2017, and has lectured for the Victorian Society and the Society for the Advancement of Social Studies. He has had the pleasure of being suspended from the tops of the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, and dozens of other icons of New York City architecture. Will, I'm going to turn it over to you. But before I do, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat or the Q&A box. And I'll turn it over to Will. Will, you've got a pretty incredible job hanging up the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building.
Certainly not boring. Never gets old. Thank you so much, Nathan. Let me see if I can share my slides. Bear with me. And okay, how are we looking?
Looks good.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. And thanks so much to the Baltimore Architecture Foundation for having me. In September of 1978, the Best Products Tilt Showroom opened at the Eudowood Plaza Shopping Center, which is now the Towson Place Shopping Center. By a show of hands or a comment in the chat, please let us know if you ever shopped at this Best Products store or if you happen to drive by it on Putty Hill Avenue and Goucher Boulevard. If you have, you're one of the lucky ones, because unfortunately, this exceptional proto-deconstructivist building was replaced by a run-of-the-mill Target in the 1990s. Tonight, I'd like to share with you how this surrealist-inspired work of art, which fused public sculpture and architecture, came to be located in such an unlikely suburban setting, and how a group of artists and sculptors came to design some of the most well-publicized works of postmodern architecture. For those of you that aren't familiar, Best Products was a retail chain that sold home goods from 1957 to 1997. At its peak, they had about 170 stores nationwide. Most of these were your typical big box store like the one you see here, which was coming to dominate suburbia in the 1960s and 70s. Best Products had an innovative catalog showroom business model, which you can kind of think of a little bit like an IKEA, where the store had, the stores were called showrooms, and they had one fully assembled and operable version of every product on the shelves. So if you decided you wanted to purchase one, you would jot down the item number and a sales associate would retrieve the item from the back and bring it to you at the register. This unique sales approach kept operating costs low and thus enabled Best Products to charge less than their retail competitors. Best Products was founded in Richmond, Virginia by Sidney and Francis Lewis. Thanks to the success of their business, the Lewises began to develop an art collection. And much of that collection is now at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which is where this photo is taken. Pretty early on in their collecting, the Lewises decided they wanted to collect works by living artists, especially ones that they could develop relationships and friendships with. As a result, they acquired works and developed friendships with Andy Warhol, Chuck Close, Alex Katz, and many others. On a few occasions, they even traded products from their stores for artworks, which is a pretty incredible deal. You know, you give a few camcorders to your friend Andy Warhol when he's getting into video, and he sends you an incredible portrait like this one. One of the artists with whom they became friends was a sculptor named James Wines. James Wines was actually a graduate of Towson High School, class of 1951. So if we have any other Towson High alumni in the audience, please give a shout out in the chat. The Lewises initially met James Wines in his studio in Broome Street around 1965. They became fast friends and kept up regular correspondence thereafter. Wines was a very successful sculptor in the 1950s and 60s, working mostly in steel and bronze. But by the late 1960s, he'd gotten bored with the conventions of sculpture at that time. Most big commissions for public sculpture around that time were for corporate plazas in front of kind of mundane, run-of-the-mill, international-style office buildings. They were often afterthoughts, just plunked down to make the plazas less of a barren concrete wasteland. Wines would describe these placeless commercial sculptures as visual pollution, and he coined the terms plop art and turd in the plaza to describe what he considered to be banal, oversized knickknacks and unwelcome urban intrusions. But at the same time, many of Wines's neighbors, his artist neighbors in Soho, were working to push the bounds of sculpture as part of the environmental and earth art movements. Here is Gordon Matta Clark's work from 1964 titled Splitting, where he literally cut this house in two. Or this is Robert Smithson's famous spiral jetty. And as you can see with both of these works, they're both very much inspired by their contexts, and they become a part of the environments in which they exist. While teaching a course on environmental art at NYU and giving lectures at several other institutions, Wines gathered a following of similar-minded sculptors and artists who were united by a belief that visual art in the built environment should relate to and interact with its architectural and environmental contexts. During the summer of 1969, Wines motivated this young band of fellow artists to form an organization called SITE, an acronym for Sculpture in the Environment. By 1970, this group established a charter which outlined its founding principles. Chief among them was a conviction that, quote, sculpture conviction that sculpture, conceptually realized to involve a total site, is preferable to the decorative placement of object art in an architectural context. Wines, who was the leader of the group, was 37 years old, and most of the other members were in their early 20s and fresh out of college. So most of the founding members pictured here had backgrounds in the visual arts or liberal arts, but initially the group did not have any architects on board. And for the first few years, they operated as a nonprofit that conducted lectures at schools and produced unsolicited, and they also produced unsolicited theoretical design proposals, like this one here, which is for an installation on the General Motors building in New York City on Fifth Avenue, which has this kind of bland, or at the time pretty bland, concrete plaza in front. SITE proposed adding a jagged red stripe to the exterior of the building, which is reminiscent of a graph of a stock, which is either ascending or plummeting depending on your point of view. Or there is this proposal for the redevelopment of a vacant lot in Binghamton, New York. And for this one, they produced this eye-catching model, which has this wavy wooden dock that went up the side of the adjacent building. In this concept, neither the building nor this undulating dock form take precedence. They sort of kind of meld together, and they form something that is greater than the sum of their parts. But despite working diligently on these projects for the better part of 2 years, the group still did not have any built work to show for it. Things like this are daring, and they require a really bold client with vision and deep pockets to achieve. Throughout this time, though, James Wines had kept up correspondence with his friends and patrons, Sidney and Francis Lewis. He would send caricature sketches to Sidney Lewis for his birthday, like this one of Sidney as Lorenzo de Medici. And the Lewises were certainly people that appreciated a good joke, and that's reflected in their witty correspondence with James. In one letter to the Lewises, Wines joked, I'm trying to get this site organization of mine on the road with about as much business talent as a Girl Scout selling cookies. I'm having some luck with respect to interest, but not much when it comes to hard commitments. I shall give this whole thing a year to take hold, and then if it doesn't work, I'll throw myself into a Wall Street canyon from the executive suite of some banking firm. I figured the publicity would be great for site and give it an instant status in the world of high finance. These efforts finally paid off in 1971 when Sidney Lewis agreed to give site their first commission. From Sidney Lewis's perspective, quote, "The idea came from Jim, not from us. Jim started talking about their interest in doing some buildings. And at the time, there was one building I always considered an eyesore from the beginning. That was our South Richmond building. And I said, Jim, I'd be very interested to get some proposals from you as to what you could do with that building. It would be a good chance. You've never done anything with a building, and we'd be receptive to anything, any kind of improvement." Wines and his young team of artists dove right into the project and produced a number of proposals and models for the store. All of these proposals were kept to exterior interventions. Francis Lewis summed it up succinctly by saying, "We wanted a terrific piece of architecture which would not cost a lot and which would not in any way meddle with the inside of the building, where every square foot of storage space or display space was non-negotiable." The proposal that the Lewises ended up building was this one, which was by Cynthia Erdely, which came to be known as the Peel. It was completed in 1972. And the Peeling project was exactly the aesthetic and popular hit that site needed to enter into the world of architecture. They purportedly accomplished the project with a total budget of only $25,000, of which site put everything into construction and did not take a commission themselves. It was widely publicized in newspapers across the country as a cultural curiosity, but it also made it into some international design publications such as Casa Bella, L'Espresso, and L'Architettura. And here we have several other concepts that were produced by Cynthia Erdely that were produced around this time, 1971 roughly. And most notably for the main subject of tonight's talk, we have this one here on the right, which features a tilted facade, which may have been an early iteration of the Tilt Showroom in Towson. The Lewises recognized the potential in the free publicity that the Peel showroom received for what had been a relatively inexpensive building modification. So they continued to commission buildings from site. There were 9 total that were constructed that the site designed. And here is the second one they did. This one is the Indeterminate Facade in Houston, which was a brand new building. So it was ground up. The first one was a modification of an existing building. But this one, they designed the exterior, with a blank slate, more or less. But the concept, the title, the Indeterminate Facade, that concept of indeterminacy is key here to understanding the work, as the shopper is immediately has questions like, what's going on here? What happened to this building? Is it being constructed or demolished? And what does it all mean? Site was very cleverly taking the architectural typology of the big box store and turning it into the subject matter for their art. At the same time, it's sort of the same thing that artists like Marcel Duchamp were doing, what Duchamp did with the bicycle wheel. Site turned the building into a piece of conceptual art, where the idea behind the work is more important than the form itself. Much of Site's work is informed by and in response to the work of Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. In particular, their concept of the duck versus the decorated shed. In this dichotomy, a duck is a building where the interior space and structure are subservient to the overall symbolic form which expresses its function. And a decorated shed is a more generic structure that has signage applied to the exterior, and that signage then communicates the function. And in many ways, a decorated shed is more efficient and direct in communicating its purpose. In 1972, in an article that Wines wrote in response to Venturi and Scott Brown's seminal book, Learning from Las Vegas, Wines advocated for what he called DDT, or duck design theory, in which he extolled the virtues of sculptural buildings. Chief among them is their ability to captivate the imagination, a concept which Wines referred to as form-following fantasy. And just as an aside, Wines was personal friends with Scott Brown and Venturi, and introduced them to the Lewis's, who later commissioned them to do a building for best products, which is the building you see here, which is the epitome of a decorated shed. So for their next best products building, they continued to sort of follow this form-following fantasy mode with their exterior interventions or their exterior designs for these buildings. And here is their third building, the Notch building, where one whole corner of the building slides out to reveal the entrance. And here it is on opening day when they dramatically released hundreds of balloons. And this notch on the corner weighed 42 tons. One of the engineers that helped design the mechanism that slid it back also worked on the lunar rover for one of the Apollo missions. This engineering feat certainly emboldened Sight for their next project, which was perhaps their most audacious structural stunt. And that brings us to the fourth out of the 9 showrooms that Sight designed for best products, and my personal favorite, the Tilt Showroom in Towson. Sight began designing this showroom around 1976 and was completed in October of 1978, and it immediately drew praise, criticism, and crowds of curious shoppers. An article in the Baltimore Sun quipped, "There hasn't been an earthquake in Maryland in over 90 years, but a new building in Towson may cause some people to think otherwise." The facade of concrete blocks was unnervingly floating above the heads of shoppers to reveal the glass entrance behind. The building supposedly caused a number of minor collisions on the street out front because of shocked motorists passing by and staring up in disbelief. And for the grand opening of the building, Best even enhanced the sense of vertigo by having a performer dressed as Spider-Man rappel down the facade. The engineer for the project was Weidlinger and Associates. So they're the ones who came up with the scheme for pulling this magic trick off, for seemingly effortlessly levitating this whole slab of masonry. And it was quite a feat, not just in terms of engineering. The wall was 14 inches thick and weighed 450 tons. The construction ended up being quite labor intensive because the masons couldn't rely on their typical plumb lines and levels. To achieve the angled courses in the concrete block, they had to shave almost every piece in order to get them to line up and sit properly. On a practical level, this tilted plane creates an awning, which gives the shoppers shelter from the rain or the sun. But more importantly, it had this fantastic sculptural quality and created these interesting slices of light behind the tilted plane. And in many ways, the Towson Tilt building played with a number of concepts that later came to be associated with the deconstructivist movement in architecture. However, in the 1988 MoMA show on deconstructivist architecture, the curators, Philip Johnson and Mark Wigley, pointedly dismissed Sight's work as not part of the movement, but merely a simulation of deconstructive work in other disciplines because they do not exploit the unique conditions of the architectural object. Wines responded to the dismissal in a letter to Philip Johnson saying, "To say Mr. Wigley missed the point of Sight's work is an understatement. He committed the cardinal sin of all criticism to assume that the superficial appearance of an object is in fact its meaning, that fragmented and dematerialized sections of buildings refer specifically to demolition and ruin alone." And many other architects at the time were also dismissive of Sight's work because they thought it was just architectural gimmicks to get people to come in the stores. But that wasn't really the point. The real intent was to engage with the public. Sight wanted to prompt serious art and architectural discussions with these buildings. The provocation here is deliberate. The buildings were very directly challenging your expectations and inviting you to engage with them either mentally by questioning your equilibrium or physically, as these boys are doing here on the left. Later best products buildings by site challenged expectations and invited shoppers to engage in other ways. Here's the Forest building in Richmond, Virginia, where the facade has been split off from the rest of the building and nature has been allowed to take over the architecture. Or there's this one, the Cutler Ridge showroom in Miami, where the facade has been taken apart like a jigsaw puzzle, and then you're invited to mentally put it back together. Or the Inside Outside showroom in Milwaukee, where the function of the building is revealed via this cutaway, which makes you think maybe that you have developed Superman's X-ray vision. Like the Tilt, these showrooms prompted the observer to ask questions and engage with the architecture in ways that most suburban shoppers probably weren't used to. When the Tilt building was under construction, the Baltimore Sun ran an article about it where they were talking to the neighbors, and they interviewed them, and they said the neighbors were taking bets on whether the building would remain tilted. And that's kind of the whole point. Site wanted these buildings to incite curiosity and invite people to think about art, architecture, and sculpture in a new way. When the Tilt was demolished to make way for the current target that currently occupies the site, Charm City's preeminent cultural ambassador, John Waters, was quoted in the paper saying, "It figures, anything with originality, they would tear it down. But rather than focus on the loss of the Tilt, I think we should celebrate its achievements." The Tilt and the other best products buildings are still captivating the imaginations of ordinary people. Photos of these buildings are all over Reddit, where a younger audience is discovering them for the first time. And I think it's a testament to the power of the concepts that site put forth that the images of these structures are still able to inspire people today. And with that, I would like to open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much. This is a really great presentation, and we have a few comments in the chat that I wanted to bring to your attention. We have a few people who remember shopping at the Best Product store. One person who actually worked there for a few years, which is very cool to see. And also we have someone here who went to Penn State and had James Wines as the professor.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, really cool. So one good question we have is, how many site buildings are still standing?
It depends on how you quantify it. Really, the only one that is left that looks as it did originally is the Forest building in Richmond, which is currently home to I believe it's a Baptist church. Unfortunately, the other buildings were either demolished or altered beyond recognition.
And we have a question here about the Towson building. You know, it's funny that you mentioned earthquakes. I think like in the past 12 years since I've been living in the city, we've had a few earthquakes. So it's no longer like a once in a century type thing. This question is, when was the Tilt building demolished? And was there any effort to preserve it?
I don't think there was so much. I believe it was in 1996, if I'm not mistaken. And there was certainly an outcry from a lot of locals because it was a much beloved building, but I don't think it didn't. It wasn't on any historic registers or anything because it was too young at the time to be on most. So yeah, I think there was local outcry that I saw in articles at the time, but I don't think there was a formal movement to preserve it.
And the question here is, scroll back up to find this. Are there buildings by site besides the best showrooms that are still standing? I thought there were a few, including a Shake Shack in New York.
Yeah, that's a very beloved building in New York. It's the Shake Shack in Union Square. In Madison Square. Yeah, that's one of their probably most well-known currently in New York City. So they have other works that are elsewhere, a lot in Asia. But I think for most people, they're most well known for the best product stores.
We have someone here mentioned about the Tilt building, that there were zigzag railings near the lower edge so that shoppers wouldn't hit their head on the lower edge of the wall. I'm tall. I love the dissonance of head and bottom of the wall. Nice practical feature. And also, here's a good question. Do you have a personal favorite showroom?
Yeah, it would have to be the Tilt for sure. I just think it's really neat. It's just astounding that they were able to pull it off. It's there's so much steel that went into this. So I think it's an impressive feat, both architecturally and structurally.
And we have a question here. What got you interested in Sight's work?
I have a good friend and mentor who actually worked at Best Products and was good friends with the Lewises. So he informed me about them, first of all. And yeah, I just took it from there and used it as the subject for my master's thesis.
Nice. And one question I have for you is like we're entering now a time where buildings from the 1970s are reaching that like 50-year mark, right? And so are now becoming eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And I just curious to get your thoughts on preservation efforts for postmodern buildings, which are typically maligned. A lot of postmodern buildings are maligned and sort of seen as eyesores, but there's also this sort of funny, or this like sort of funny place where like, you reach like the 50-year mark and buildings from 50 years ago are kind of seen as ugly. Well, so I just wanted to get your opinion about like efforts underway to preserve postmodern buildings.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Really, just if they can make it past that 50-year mark, I think then people they accept them more. They appreciate them more for being of their time. And I don't think all of them will survive, but really, if this is one that really should have. So yeah, it's quite sad with all the Best Products buildings. The Lewises sold the company in the 80s, I believe. And after that, the investors that bought it sort of ran it into the ground by some accounts. And so if Best Products was still around the company, I think these showrooms would still be here today, which is, unfortunate.
Also, we have Stephanie Brick here saying that if you're interested in learning more about Sight, that she's in touch with James Wines. And I thought that James might have been attending this. I'm not sure if he's actually here. If you're here, James, say a few words in the chat. We'd love to hear from you too. Oh, never mind. Stephanie was saying that was a message for the two of us. Last call for any final questions. And if you have any final remarks about Best Products.
Just that I was delighted to share about this building with people. I'm sure there's probably some people who this might have been their first time being exposed to the Best Product stores. So it's kind of neat that they still are able to inspire. Yeah,
and it's funny that you brought up Reddit and like social media and how these buildings have found a new audience there. And you were talking about the thing with like the duck building versus like the and it seems like on social media like today, like the duck buildings are the things that really resonate with people, right? It's like people like one building that I see like almost like every day like on Twitter is like that fisheries building, the one in India that's like the giant building that's shaped like a fish. Actually like a fisheries. It's actually like a government fisheries building. But that sort of stuff is really sort of resonating today. So I think like one thing it'd be funny to like think about like, if if site was still practicing today, are they still practicing today?
Yeah, in some, I think not as much as they were before, but James Wines is still active.
Yeah, it's just so fun to see this sort of playfulness with architecture, and also just the way that it really resonates with people. So that was any more questions coming into the chat, but thank you so much for making the time to talk with us today. And I am going to put a link to our YouTube channel into the chat box. So this program was recorded, and if you wanted to see this program again later, or if you want to see any of our other virtual programs, if you go to our website, you can find everything we've done. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great night. And I also hope that you can join us tomorrow at 1 o'clock for our final virtual presentation of Doors Open, which will be about the Poppleton neighborhood. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nathan.